because First Chronicles is written about the events that happened before the captivity, when David and Solomon were king, and Saul before that, to a people that are several generations removed. The author of First and Second Chronicles, originally just one book, probably Ezra, is very selective, very editorial in the way he tells the stories, because he's trying to emphasize some key spiritual concepts that Israel had forgotten. And the promises originally made to Israel, way back when with Moses, were all hinged on what Israel heard was, you will be given a land and you will be a powerful nation. That's what they heard. What they didn't hear was the condition, the condition, if you are faithful to me. And they had somehow had that disconnect between what it meant to live by faith, those life faith skills, and their reality of expressing that on a regular basis. And we sometimes also forget that Israel never stopped worshiping God. They never abandoned Yahweh and the old covenant completely. What they did was they redefined it and they added to it. And so they had the worship of the Ashtoreth and of Baal and of Marduk and of other gods at the same time. So the exclusivity that God expected was not there. So as we look at First Chronicles, we're going to wrap it up today. There are some very definite points of contact between them and between us, as they struggled coming out of a context of pluralism and of great influence of the religions of the other nations. So today, there are a lot of external pressures on us to maintain our integrity in worshiping exclusively the one true God. So we understand the tension that they lived in. It's not so different from the tension that we feel today. And I see in First Chronicles the instructions that are helpful and encouraging for us to reform, to reframe our understanding of what does it mean to be faithful. The chronicler is concerned about three major themes. Who is our God? Who is this one that we say we worship? Because if you have been raised in a tradition that says, if you follow all these rules, you're guaranteed these outcomes, and then you're now the product of generations of refugees, exiles, who are not receiving that blessing, you're going to ask, well, who is this God? And this really isn't fair. Why am I suffering for what those people did? So who is this God? And then another question the chronicler tries to answer is, what does faith or faithlessness look like? How can we identify it? And then if we know what faithlessness is, how do we nurture faith in the one true God? And then finally, is there hope? Because their reality was they're prisoners. They were slaves in Babylon. They were not enjoying the blessings of God. Is there hope? Will we still see God's blessing? So what I've done this morning is I've circled back up to a high altitude and looked at some texts and just pulled verses out that answer these three questions. So the first question we're going to try and answer is, who is our God? And I'm going to give you the answer first, and then we will observe it through the texts that we see. The God that the chronicler is presenting to these refugees is a God who is active. He is engaged and observant of his people. So he's not just sitting back, having started this thing, wound it up and thrown it into space, and everything's just going to happen. On one hand, we have the tension where God is sovereign and everything in his sovereignty is working according to the counsel of his will, according to Ephesians. And yet at the same time, we have a God who is personal and engaged. And in our human minds, we cannot reconcile that. And that's a good thing, because if we could decode that, it would mean that God's intelligence was equal to ours, or our intelligence was equal to God's. So we see a God who is active, who's observant and engaged. We see a God who is personal. And this means he is relational. He is not just a force or an energy. So they worshiped the nations around Israel at this time, the God of thunder, the God of the seas, the God of you name it. And these forces of nature that were beyond their ability to understand, that were overwhelming, and they were at the whim of the forces of nature. A good crop could be wiped out by one storm. An entire planting season could be destroyed by one drought. These forces were beyond what they could understand or control. So God, small g God, became these forces. And now they need to relearn who is their God. And then the third thing that we see about this God is that he is global. He is the universal God, the one and only God. So he's active, he's observant, engaged, and personal, and he's global. And as we look at these verses, we will see these things illustrated. So, 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 3. And right in the middle of this genealogy of who's born to who is born to who, and I'm going to just kind of slur over these names, forgive me for that. But it says, the sons of Judah, and it begins to list them, Onan, and Shelah. These three Bathshua the Canaanite bore to him. Now Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord. What does that tell us? God was watching him. And here's a guy of the tribe of Judah, which is the southern tribe, which is the audience to whom this book is written. They were the ones. It was the ones of the tribe of Benjamin and Judah who went back into Jerusalem. So he is part of this tribe, and he did evil, and God saw it. And so he, that's God, put him to death. God is active. God is watching. God is observant. God is personal. Now, very negative here, and we don't know what he did. But the message to these people is that God sees. And he sees the evil, and he sees the righteousness. 1 Chronicles 5:20. And when they prevailed over them, this is talking about one of the battles, the Hagrites and those who were with them were given into their hands, that is, into Israel's hands. Why? For they cried out to God in battle. What does this say? God heard. God is personal. God observed. God responded. God cared for his people. And he granted their urgent plea. Why? Because they trusted in him. And what did Psalm 146 say at the very beginning? Our trust is not in horses or in warriors, but our trust is in the Lord our God. So this is just these passing comments that saturate throughout the book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, reminding Israel, contextualizing these theological truths, you might call it truth faith, in human history, that here is how God interacted with his people. A couple more. 1 Chronicles 6, verse 15. 1 Chronicles 6:15. And Jehozadak went into exile when the Lord sent Judah and Jerusalem into exile by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. So the exile, which these people were now coming out of, was the result of God putting them there. And that blows our mind. How can God do that? How is that fair? Well, if you go all the way back to Moses, it says in Deuteronomy, if you are not faithful to me, I will scatter you amongst the nations. God is faithful to what he had already said he was going to do, and now he's doing it. But notice the agent, the last part of that verse. They went into exile by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, one of the most evil rulers of his day. And yet God used him to accomplish his purposes. So even Nebuchadnezzar is subject to the authority of God. 1 Chronicles 9:20. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, was the chief officer over them in the time past, and the Lord was with him. This is a personal God. Here's a guy that takes on a role to serve God, and God, the Lord Yahweh, was with him. What a great comfort to know God was with this leader. 1 Chronicles 14:17. And the fame of David went out into all the lands, and the Lord brought the fear of him upon all nations. People were afraid of David. Why? Not because David was super king, because God did something in the hearts of those people. But not just giving him favor in the eyes of his own people, but upon all nations. God is the God of all nations. And what is happening globally, and this is applicable today, whether we're worried about what's happening in the Ukraine or in North Korea or in our own country or the United States or Ecuador or anywhere that we may be, God is the God of that nation. 1 Chronicles 17:20, there is none like you, O Lord. There is no God beside you, according to all that we have heard with our ears. In this great prayer, there is a confession of the uniqueness of God. There is no God besides our God. This exclusive, caring nature of God, that he is personal, that he is global, he's universal, that he's engaged and observant and he responds to the needs of his people. And he is worshiped in these words, there is none like you, O Lord. There is no God beside you. There is no other. And then 1 Chronicles 29, verse 12, both riches and honor come from you, and you rule over all. God does rule over all. He is the source of all things. In your hand are power and might. In your hand it is to make great and to give strength to all. It is God who enables. It is God who accomplishes. And although he uses human agents or other powers like maybe the natural world or whatever it may be, all of it is subject to God. He alone is God. And this is the God Israel's being reminded, despite hundreds of years now in captivity, and being surrounded by worldviews and religions that were completely anti the one true God, who worshiped the forces of nature, who worshiped through promiscuity and prostitution, who offered sacrifices of children and did all kinds of horrific things. In the midst of that, the one true God continues to be exalted and to hold his place as the only creator God, the one and only to whom our allegiance is due. So who is this God? He is a personal God, an engaged God, an observing God, a global God. And this is the one that Ezra, as he writes this story of Israel, over and over again is trying to pull Israel back to remember, don't forget your roots. Despite your experience and the experience of your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents and your great-great-great-grandparents and your aunts and your uncles, and all the way back to before David, this is the God who has created you to be his people. So the second question then is, what does faith look like? What does faithlessness look like? So back to the beginning of the book in chapter 2, verse 7. Faith and faithlessness, life, faith, skills, living by faith, begins by being aware first of who this God is, sensitizing ourselves to who he is, and knowing that despite what we may observe, our empirical observations, God's hands are involved in creation. Living with integrity before the nations and before God because we are convinced of his presence, of his engagement, and confessing our submission to this God, our dependence on this God, our loyalty to this God, to his king and his kingdom. And because we know these things are true from what we've seen about who is our God, the contrast in Chronicles, the chronicler seems to emphasize what not to do. So 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 7. The son of Carmi, again, going through all of these genealogies, the son of Carmi, Achan, the troubler of Israel, who broke faith in the matter of the devoted thing. You remember the story of Achan when they're going into the promised land and they took over the city, and there were everything was to be dedicated to God for use in the tabernacle, and Achan saw some silver and gold and stuff, and he hid it under his tent, and then it was discovered after Israel suffered some losses, and they determined that it was Achan, and ultimately there was punishment on him and his family. He's described as the one who broke faith in the devoted thing. What is Israel doing? What are these exiles doing? They're coming back and rebuilding the city and the temple, restoring worship of the one true God. And that's a major theme throughout 1 Chronicles, getting back to worshiping this one true God. And a negative example is, don't forget the guy who tried to steal, who tried to divert resources intended for the temple and keep it for himself. It doesn't work. Chapter 5, verse 25, but they broke faith with the God of their fathers. And then a very graphic image. We're adults here, we can handle this. But this is the imagery. This is how vile idolatry is in the eyes of God. They broke faith with the God of their fathers and whored after the gods of the peoples of the land whom God had destroyed before them. They prostituted themselves. The faithfulness, the covenant faithfulness, that is that which is represented in marriage, to break that kind of adultery is exactly what Israel did to God. And if we understand faithlessness in terms of that disloyalty, it should give us cause to recommit ourselves to being faithful. Chapter 9, verse 1. So all Israel was recorded in genealogies, and these are written in the book of the kings of Israel. And Judah was taken into exile because of their breach of faith, their faithlessness. Chapter 10, verse 13. So Paul died for his breach of faith. He broke faith with the Lord in that he did not keep the command of the Lord, and also consulted a medium seeking guidance. We looked at that a few weeks back. Chapter 28, verses 7 to 9. I will establish his kingdom forever if he continues strong in keeping my commandments and my rules as he is today. Now therefore, in the sight of all Israel, the assembly of the Lord, and in the hearing of our God. So going back to, here's a God who is present, who's aware, who's observant. Seek out the commandments of the Lord your God, that you may possess this good land and leave it as an inheritance to your children after you forever. In other words, know God and be faithful to him. So what does faith or faithlessness look like? Life, faith, skill is primarily a question of loyalty. Am I going to commit myself to the integrity, not just integrity in that I do what's right, keep the rules, but integrity that my primary loyalty is to God above all else, even when it's going to cost me, even when it's not to my advantage. The thing that Israel forgot is they thought they were about nation building. They thought they were about becoming the big influencer, and that if they had God on their side, the biggest God of all of them, they could become the dominant force. And what they saw in that was very short term, that this is to my benefit, that we can become the most powerful nation. And how convenient would that be? Rather than recognizing all the way back from the Garden of Eden, they were, as God's image bearers, to be his representatives in his creation. Not building a nation for the sake of political or economic or geographic superior power and influence, but that they would have credibility in representing God. And I think there's a parallel for us today, that we're not into nation building, but if you'll forgive the sort of bad dad joke here, we're bodybuilders. Bodybuilders in the sense that we're seeking to build a body of Christ, not a building, not a corporation, not an institution, not a denomination, not a legacy that someday this room will be renamed the Graham Bulmer Memorial Chapel or something. No, but we're here to build the body of Christ and to live faithfully before him, not only to represent him well, but to encourage one another, because there are times when all of us need that encouragement, where faith just doesn't seem to be cutting it anymore. And if we're building the body, we're not building an institution or something that becomes influential because of its size, but something that permeates and represents Christ well. So that's what faith looks like, and that was the thing that they forgot. And then thirdly, what is our hope? And throughout the Old Testament, and this is why so much of the Old Testament is misunderstood today, there is this emphasis on God's blessing, because all the way back to Abraham said, through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And they have been. Ultimately, that's fulfilled in Christ and his atoning work, his work on the cross, his sinless life, his resurrection, and someday, as we've been reminded here with our first Advent, his second coming. And what an incredible event that is going to be. So we do have this hope. But Israel had redirected or had misplaced the hope that they had, because they saw blessing merely as my immediate gratification of God giving me my solutions to my problems now, rather than seeing the goodness of God in every detail. And what God is desiring is not simply that we have a comfortable life, but that we are equipped in faith to represent him well and have faith conversations with people. Because the reality is, even Israel, if they had kept every law and every commandment and had lived in perfect obedience to God and were the unquestioned recipients of his covenant blessing, still lived in a broken world, and they would still experience all of the trauma that sin brings to each of us every day. Because the world's broken, we're broken. But through faith, we are being restored and reconciled. We have been reconciled, and our heart and our nature and our characters being transformed by the Spirit of God. So what does it mean here when we see these blessings? Well, obviously, it means this relationship with God and faith with him. But it's also recognizing that we are submitting to God's greater plan, that he is accomplishing good things, even though sometimes uncomfortable for us. And in the context of 1 Chronicles, so please hear me, we can't just take some of these verses out and plug them into today. As the Israelites are going back, as God is restoring them after they have gone through all of the judgment because of their unfaithfulness, they're now being urged to be faithful, and they're going back with virtually nothing. The other nations give them stuff. It's amazing how God blesses them by bringing all the resources to rebuild from the other nations. And what Ezra is trying to help them understand is the blessing is God's provision for what you need in the moment. It's not necessarily the excesses or the solutions, but what you need in this moment is the blessing of God. It's part of that understanding that God is a God who's personal and engaged in the here and now. So let's take a look at a couple of blessing texts. Chapter 12, 1 Chronicles 12:22. From day to day, men came to David to help him until there was a great army, like an army of God. It was the army of God because he was the king of God's people. But every day, this army didn't just appear out of heaven, but as people responded, as they saw what God was doing back in David's day, and this is in the context of Saul trying to kill David and David ascending to the throne, people, not just because they were figuring out which side of the toast was buttered, because God was doing something, they were aligning themselves with the one who was the anointed king that had been chosen to be the leader. And so every day, and as David assumed that leadership position, it wasn't just plopped on him. He went through incredible trials before he became king. In fact, he had the chance to usurp the whole process. Saul's sleeping in a cave, and David sneaks up. He has the chance to kill him. He knows he's going to be king. And David chooses not to do that, taunts him a little bit, but he respects that Saul is still the king. And day to day, people came and aligned themselves with David. 1 Chronicles 12:38-40. All these men of war, so part of being a king is you do need to have the military behind you, arrayed in battle order, came to Hebron with a whole heart to make David king over all Israel. Now, how does that happen? How do people transfer their loyalty from Saul to David? It's not just political expediency. God did something. He was providing for David, and the hidden story here is what God is doing. Now notice the next phrase, likewise. All the rest of Israel were of a single mind. When does that ever happen? That everybody's in agreement. The only time that happens is when God is working and God is blessing. God blessing not in the sense of giving us stuff, but providing for us what we need on a day-to-day basis. Likewise, the rest of Israel were of a single mind and made David king. 1 Chronicles 13:14. And the ark of God remained with the household of Obed-Edom in his house for 3 months. And the Lord blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that he had. In other words, he experienced unprecedented good stuff in this setting because the symbolic presence of God was with him. What's the message to Israel? Get that temple rebuilt. Worship the one true God, because this is the God who will meet your needs. This is the God who will provide what you need. Then in chapter 26, verse 5, Ameliel the 6th, Issachar the 7th, Peliethai the 8th, for God blessed him. Again, in the list of all the people that were becoming loyal and were part of this new structure under David, they came together because God blessed them. And it's very hard to deprogram our minds because we are so used to hearing blessing means God giving stuff. No, blessing means God sustaining for what we need day by day. And in Psalm 119, verses 65 to 67, I refer to that text a lot, but it's kind of buried there in the middle of Psalm 119. It says, "Until I was afflicted, I went astray. But now, O God, I have learned your precepts, for you are good, and all that you do is goodness." And that's the blessing of God. Because we know who God is, the one and only, there is no other, the Creator God, the global universal God, the personal God, the engaged, observant, active God. Even when we go through those moments where we do go astray, because none of us are perfect, even those are redeemed by God because he is good and all that he does is goodness. And that is his blessing upon us. And we need to understand that in order to put the other texts that are famous in the New Testament, all things work together for good. Yeah, man, let's not quote that to people who are going through tough times. That's the last thing they need to hear. But let's embrace that while we are nurturing what it means to live by faith, so that when we are in the tough time, we are prepared to know that God is still good. That's what it means to be blessed, to see and experience God's goodness.